Tariffs, tension, and tough talk. It's one of the most volatile times in the relationship between Canada and the United States.
Last year alone, the United States imported more than $3 trillion in goods. And with broad tariffs layered across major trading partners, including Canada, even a 10% average increase translates into hundreds of billions of dollars in added annual costs that do not leave foreign capitals, but land directly inside the American economy. What was introduced as strength in a deepening trade war is now raising a far more uncomfortable question. Did the United States just impose one of the largest indirect consumption taxes in modern economic history on itself? Canada, long assumed to be economically vulnerable due to its reliance on the United States market, was expected to buckle under pressure. 3/4 of its exports traditionally flow south. The prediction was immediate: job losses, factory shutdowns, economic contraction. That collapse did not happen. Instead, something structurally different began unfolding across North America, a shift that may quietly redefine the balance of economic leverage between the United States and Canada in this trade war. And the most unsettling numbers are only beginning to surface. If $3 trillion in annual imports face even a 10% average tariff exposure, the direct cost shock exceeds $300 billion per year. That figure alone rivals the entire annual economic output of many mid-sized nations. And in a trade war environment where tariffs expand across sectors rather than remaining targeted, that cost multiplies across supply chains. The United States does not import finished goods alone. It imports intermediate inputs: aluminum from Canada, steel components, industrial machinery parts, precision electronics, energy products. More than 40% of imports are production inputs used by American manufacturers. When tariffs increase the cost of those inputs, domestic production costs rise before a single product reaches a store shelf. Consider the automotive sector. A vehicle assembled in the United States can cross the border with Canada multiple times during production. Each crossing under a tariff regime increases cumulative cost. A 5% cost increase on aluminum, layered with transportation volatility, insurance adjustments, and compliance overhead, can add hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars to final vehicle pricing, depending on exposure. In an industry operating on tight margins, that is destabilizing. Construction tells a similar story. The United States consumes millions of tons of steel and aluminum annually. A 10% increase in material cost across large infrastructure projects can add billions of dollars to federal and private development budgets. Those higher costs are either passed to taxpayers or absorbed through reduced project scope. Small and medium-sized businesses are hit first. Large multinational corporations hedge, small manufacturers do not. Surveys during prior escalations of the trade war showed the majority of small firms reporting rising input costs and reduced forward confidence. When working capital requirements increase due to tariffs, hiring slows. Expansion pauses. And then there is the consumer layer. If even half of the estimated tariff burden flows downstream into retail pricing, American households face a silent tax embedded in everyday goods, appliances, vehicles, home materials, electronics. In an economy exceeding $25 trillion in annual output, even a 0.5% drag on growth equals more than $100 billion in lost economic activity in a single year. Multiply that across multiple years, and the cumulative foregone output climbs toward $500 billion. Agriculture introduces another shock channel. When the United States escalates tariffs, trading partners often retaliate. American farmers have historically required tens of billions of dollars in federal relief during heightened trade war cycles to offset export losses. Those subsidies are funded domestically, effectively recycling tariff revenue back into damage control. This is where the math becomes uncomfortable. Tariffs generate revenue, yes, but when subsidy programs slowed growth, higher consumer prices, and investment hesitation are factored in, the net economic benefit narrows dramatically. Meanwhile, Canada, the primary North American trading partner of the United States, did not implode under pressure. Instead, trade corridors began recalibrating. Diversification accelerated. European and Indo-Pacific agreements gained urgency. Energy flows adjusted strategically. The trade war was designed to force concession. Instead, it forced adaptation. And what adaptation does over time is far more consequential than any single quarter of tariff revenue. The next phase of this shift may reveal something even more profound, a structural realignment that could alter how global trade views the United States for decades. And the numbers behind that shift are even more disruptive. If the United States absorbs even $300 billion in annual tariff-related cost exposure, the immediate impact is measurable. The deeper impact, however, is structural and potentially far more disruptive. The trade war did not strike an isolated system. It hit an economy already navigating supply chain recalibration, labor constraints, elevated interest rates, and persistent inflation pressure. When tariffs layer onto that environment, the friction compounds rather than dissipates. The United States conducts more than $700 billion in annual two-way trade with Canada. Canada is not a marginal partner. It is one of the largest export destinations for American goods and one of the most significant suppliers of critical inputs. Energy, aluminum, automotive components, and agricultural products are embedded in American production capacity. When tariffs enter that ecosystem, uncertainty spreads faster than the legal framework that defines them. Corporations do not plan around today's tariff schedule. They plan around the risk of tomorrow's escalation. In a trade war environment, policy unpredictability raises risk premiums in long-term capital models. Even a modest increase in projected input volatility can redirect billions of dollars in foreign direct investment. Once investment shifts, it rarely returns quickly. Canada recognized this inflection point and chose diversification over escalation. It intensified trade engagement with Europe and Indo-Pacific partners while reinforcing existing agreements. Infrastructure at Atlantic and Pacific ports expanded capacity to handle alternative corridors. Critical mineral development accelerated as global demand for lithium, nickel, and cobalt surged. Global investors prioritize predictability, institutional continuity, and regulatory clarity during volatility cycles. Canada projected those qualities consistently, positioning itself as a stable counterweight in the trade war environment. The United States projected strength through tariffs, but strength accompanied by uncertainty. In global trade systems exceeding $30 trillion annually, even a 1% reallocation equals hundreds of billions of dollars shifting direction. This shift is not collapse. It is gradual erosion of centrality. Over time, erosion compounds more powerfully than a single headline shock. When trading partners diversify away from heavy concentration in the United States, they do so permanently, not temporarily. Supply chain resilience becomes the objective, not maximum efficiency. The trade war also altered alliance psychology. When tariffs are imposed on longstanding allies such as Canada, trust recalibrates, procurement teams insert contingency clauses for future trade disruptions. Risk modeling becomes standard practice rather than exception. Diversification, once activated, becomes structural. Energy markets illustrate the embedded nature of this shift. Canada remains one of the largest foreign suppliers of crude oil to the United States. Even without dramatic trade interruption, political volatility forces companies to incorporate risk pricing into contracts. That risk premium raises costs across transportation, logistics, and manufacturing networks. Currency dynamics add further complexity. In a trade war, exchange rate volatility can amplify either export weakness or import inflation. Canada's floating currency acts as a partial shock absorber during external turbulence. The United States does not benefit from equivalent cushioning when tariffs increase input costs across import-heavy industries. For decades, the United States has functioned as the gravitational center of global trade. Broad tariffs operate as centrifugal force, encouraging partners to hedge exposure. If over the next decade, even a fraction of global trade growth bypasses the United States due to perceived instability, the cumulative output shift could reach into the trillions of dollars. That possibility alone forces multinational firms to reassess long-term allocation strategy. Meanwhile, Canada's repositioning has been deliberate and measured. Employment resilience surprised analysts who predicted contraction. Cross-border consumer flows declined, but domestic spending intensified and circulated internally. Economists describe this as multiplier reinforcement, and it buffered sectors expected to weaken sharply. The contrast in this trade war is increasingly clear. The United States absorbs the systemic friction of broad tariffs across a $25 trillion economy. Canada absorbs pressure through diversification and stability signaling. One confronts volatility internally, the other channels it into strategic adaptation. The most consequential changes may not appear in quarterly growth figures. They are unfolding in boardrooms, infrastructure investment decisions, and long-term procurement agreements quietly negotiated beyond headlines. Once supply chains redesign around reduced exposure to the United States, rebuilding prior centrality becomes exponentially more difficult. And the final layer of this story goes even deeper, because compounding inefficiencies inside the United States may begin to intersect with fiscal strain in ways that few policymakers are openly discussing. The next section exposes the numbers behind that risk and why the long-term cost of this trade war may extend far beyond tariffs themselves. The most dangerous element of a prolonged trade war is not the initial shock of tariffs. It is the compounding drag that builds quietly inside the United States economy over multiple years. When friction is layered onto a system producing more than $25 trillion in annual output, even small inefficiencies translate into massive absolute losses. A reduction of just 0.5% in annual growth equals more than $125 billion in lost economic activity in a single year. Stretch that drag across 5 years, and the cumulative foregone output approaches $600 billion. That figure does not appear in a single budget line. Yet it represents factories not expanded, jobs not created, wages not increased, and research not funded. Productivity slows first, then investment hesitates, and finally consumer confidence weakens. The mathematics of compounding inefficiency is unforgiving. Tariffs interrupt specialization and scale, which are the foundations of modern North American manufacturing. When firms are forced to source domestically at higher cost or redesign supply chains rapidly, capital diverts away from innovation and toward compliance. Legal teams expand, risk management budgets increase, inventory buffers grow, each adjustment reduces efficiency by degrees. Over time, these degrees accumulate. Lower productivity growth reduces long-term wage expansion. Slower wage expansion constrains household purchasing power. Constrained purchasing power dampens discretionary spending, which drives a majority of United States gross domestic product. The trade war becomes less about geopolitics and more about internal economic momentum. Inflation pressure adds another layer. Even if tariffs do not trigger dramatic price spikes, they establish higher structural price floors. Once businesses recalibrate pricing strategies upward to accommodate elevated input costs, reversal is rare. Consumers internalize a higher baseline cost of living. Incremental erosion of purchasing power becomes normalized. Fiscal implications deepen the strain. When tariffs disrupt agriculture, manufacturing, or energy exports, federal intervention often follows. Relief programs and subsidy packages can reach tens of billions of dollars during intense trade war cycles. Those funds are not external transfers, they are drawn from American taxpayers. Tariff revenue, once collected, is frequently recycled to stabilize the damage created by the same policy. Layer this dynamic onto a federal debt burden measured in the tens of trillions of dollars in rising interest obligations. Even a modest increase in long-term borrowing costs amplifies fiscal stress dramatically. When growth slows while debt expands, debt sustainability ratios deteriorate. Markets monitor that trajectory closely. Meanwhile, Canada operates under a different compounding structure. Diversification reduces concentration risk over time. Trade agreements beyond the United States expand gradually rather than abruptly. Immigration-driven labor growth supports workforce expansion. Financial regulation historically emphasized stability over leverage. These characteristics accumulate resilience instead of friction. As global supply chains decentralize, Canada's geographic position between Atlantic and Pacific trade corridors becomes strategic. Its reserves of energy, freshwater, agricultural land, and critical minerals gain geopolitical weight. In a fragmented global system, reliability becomes currency. Canada leverages predictability as competitive advantage. The United States remains the largest economy in the world, and its structural strengths are immense. But size does not immunize against policy-induced drag. When tariffs are deployed repeatedly within a trade war framework, multinational corporations design around instability. They hedge exposure. They allocate incremental investment elsewhere. Each incremental diversion represents growth not fully captured domestically. This is not sudden collapse. It is relative shift. Centrality erodes gradually when partners insulate themselves from volatility. Over a decade, even minor reductions in trade centrality can translate into trillions of dollars in redirected global commerce. The United States does not lose dominance overnight. It risks diluting it quietly. Canada does not need to surpass the United States in scale to benefit from this dynamic. It needs only to grow predictably while its neighbor absorbs volatility. Stability compounds just as friction compounds. In a long horizon trade war environment, compounding often determines the outcome more than rhetoric does. The uncomfortable question is whether the United States is prepared to tolerate structural drag in pursuit of leverage through tariffs. Because once supply chains, capital flows, and alliance trust recalibrate, reversing that architecture becomes exponentially harder. And the final conclusion of this analysis may be the most controversial of all. The cost of self-imposed friction may ultimately exceed the leverage it was meant to create. The closing assessment will weigh whether this trade war strategy represents disciplined recalibration or a historic economic miscalculation. The United States remains the largest and most dynamic economy in the world. Its capital markets are unmatched in depth. Its innovation ecosystem continues to lead in technology, defense, and advanced manufacturing. No serious analysis should underestimate that foundation. However, scale does not eliminate consequences. In a prolonged trade war, tariffs function not only as leverage against external partners such as Canada, but also as internal cost multipliers. When the United States imports more than $3 trillion in goods annually, even moderate tariff exposure embeds structural friction across industries that depend on integrated supply chains. The argument in favor of tariffs is straightforward. They are intended to pressure trading partners, rebalance deficits, and restore domestic production capacity. In theory, strategic tariffs can create negotiating leverage. In practice, broad application across allied economies introduces collateral cost that diffuses throughout manufacturing, agriculture, construction, and retail. Canada, widely assumed to be vulnerable due to its export exposure to the United States, did not experience systemic collapse. Instead, it accelerated diversification. Trade agreements with Europe and Indo-Pacific partners gained urgency. Infrastructure expanded. Domestic consumption cycles strengthened. Stability became a strategic asset in the trade war environment. Meanwhile, inside the United States, cost accumulation continues to operate quietly. Even fractional slowdowns in growth translate into hundreds of billions of dollars in foregone output over time. Relief programs designed to stabilize industries affected by retaliatory tariffs add fiscal complexity. Consumer purchasing power absorbs incremental erosion. The global system did not freeze under tariffs, it adapted. Supply chains diversified, procurement teams hedged geopolitical risk, investment committees recalibrated exposure models. Once that diversification is embedded, it becomes durable. The core question is not whether the United States remains powerful. It does. The question is whether repeated broad tariffs in a trade war framework strengthen long-term economic centrality or gradually dilute it by incentivizing partners, including Canada, to reduce dependency. Economic dominance in the 21st century is built not only on size, but on efficiency, predictability, and trust. If tariffs introduce sustained volatility, the compounding cost may outweigh short-term leverage gains. So here is the defining question for policymakers and voters alike. Is this trade war a bold strategic recalibration by the United States, or a costly miscalculation that accelerates diversification away from American economic centrality? For more fact-based global economic analysis focused on the United States, Canada, tariffs, and the evolving trade war landscape, subscribe and follow for continued in-depth reporting.